just to give the introduction then to Safiya. So many of you will be familiar with her book. So Safiya is an assistant professor at the University of Southern California at the Annenberg School of Communication. She is the recipient of a Hellman Fellowship and a UCLA Early Career Award. Her academic research focuses on the role of design in digital media platforms and on the internet and their impact on society. Her book is both sociological and interdisciplinary, and her work more generally, marking the ways that digital media impacts and intersects with issues of race, gender, culture, and technology design. Her monograph, which she's here to talk about this evening, on racist and sexist algorithmic bias in commercial search engines is entitled Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism, and that's published by NYU Press. And I should also say that for an academic book, it is exceptionally rare for it to sell out the first print run in the space of just 2 months. So with that, I set the bar exceptionally high.
I know, no pressure. I'm just trying to come get the microphone away.
I know that you can reach it. So without further ado, a very warm welcome to Dr. Safiya Noble.
Thank you. Thank you. You saw me creeping up because I was like, I got to get the mic away from her before she starts building it up so much that I can't deliver. So thank you all so much for coming out tonight in the rain. You know, in LA, when it rains, we're not actually coming. So thank you for coming, because we don't believe in apparently getting wet on any level when you live in all the sunshine for so long. And, you know, this is really a highlight for me, especially because my husband and my son are traveling here with me this time. And it's torture for them, but it's a highlight for me because often I'm on the road and they don't get to come with me, but to get to come to the UK is really, really special for us, so for our family. So thanks for coming out and proving to them that I actually do go out and talk to people, and I'm not just kicking it in New York or around the world when I get invited out. I thought I would talk maybe for just, 40 or 45 minutes or so, maybe less, depending on how many eyes start to close. And the lights are going down. It's optimal conditions, I see. Maybe we need those back up. And then leave some time for us to have a conversation, if you like. So that's my plan, at least for this evening. And apologies, I've got a bit of a cold, as you can hear in my voice. So I wasn't actually trying to bring the sexy Demi Moore type of sound, but weirdly I've got this thing hovering here in my throat. So let me just jump in and say that one of the things that's interesting to me about writing, having written this book, and also to have it be kind of taken up and supported right now, is that I can remember just a few years ago when I got the book contract with NYU, and I was really fighting hard to name the book Algorithms of Oppression. And I have this amazing editor at NYU Press, and she's like, Safiya, no girl, no one knows what an algorithm is. We're not doing it. And I was like, no, trust me, everyone's gonna know what an algorithm is. And she was like, no, they're not, because no one knows what that is except for you nerds. So, I mean, here we are. Now my father-in-law is like, Safiya, what's up with those algorithms? You know, so we all know about the algorithms, and I have to say part of that is because of some amazing investigative journalism that has really come out of the UK, and I think The Guardian has done such interesting and important work. I know, you know, for you, it's kind of like, oh, The Guardian, probably. But for us in the US, it's like, yeah, The Guardian, because, you know, it's like bringing the good investigative journalism at a time when investigative journalism in the US has really been defunded. And so we need that. And part of that is what makes, I think, the opportunity for this book to arrive and be understood and kind of comprehended more broadly beyond kind of this group of very astute kind of technology users and makers. So let me just say that one of the things that I am interested in doing tonight is I'm going to talk quite a bit about kind of the impetus for thinking about bias in technology, and I'm going to really foreground a lot of the U.S. context because that is what I know, but I do think that there are things that we can extrapolate and that will make sense in other parts of the world. But I do want to just kind of frame that up for you quickly. One of the things I think I've really loved is watching the kind of increasing critical stances that people are taking toward algorithms. So I really love this one Wired headline that 2017 was the year we fell out of love with algorithms. And I feel like, I got a fingerprint on that one. I was, part of some of that. Algorithms outdo us, but we still prefer human fallibility. These ideas about that tech and AI and algorithms would be a panacea of solving all of our social problems. I think we've started to see the warranted critiques emerge forward, and certainly in the U.S. we're starting to experience quite a bit of what you might call techlash, which is people being very clear about the limits, and of course not just the limits but what's at stake in many cases. And of course the congressional hearings with Mark Zuckerberg present just a few weeks ago really underscore the ways in which Silicon Valley is still reaching for AI as the way to kind of solve the next wave of problems that they're facing. And so we'll talk a little bit. I want to save some time. Most of my work is focused on Google, but I certainly do think a lot about Facebook and Twitter and other platforms. And so we can spend some time talking about that as well. Now, this has been the dominant narrative about technology for, Wendy Chong really, I think, in 2016 in her important book, really helped us kind of understand control and freedom, understand that this was the utopia that was promised of the internet. And I think most of us who have been on the web for a long time, I've certainly been on the web since before, Netscape, back on the BBSs. I remember, in fact, saying to my friends, I first got email, I want to say it might have been like 1989. I'm old as hell, you guys. So it might have been like 89 or 90. I was an adult, I wasn't 5. And I remember thinking, this is terrible. This is a terrible idea. Who is going to want to sit at a computer all day and type when you could just pick up the phone? And now, try to call me and see if you're going to get an answer. It's not going to happen. So this idea that we would somehow have a better experience online than we have in real life, that the internet would be this tool of freedom, and that would free us from our race, our class, and our sex, is really, I think, been the site of inquiry for critical tech and digital media studies scholars for, easily the last 15 years. And I, see myself working kind of in this tradition, certainly thinking about not just, Professor Chun's work, but also people like Anna Everett and other scholars who have really helped us to think about what's at stake and who's at stake in many of the platforms that we're engaging with. And certainly, if anything, most of us who experience kind of a gendered life, a racialized life, we know that the internet is far from a safe space or a place where we can be free from our experiences. In fact, it can many times be a source of incredible pain, trolling, hate, and other types of experiences that come at us. I've been thinking in particular about Black bodies, and I argue increasingly that Black bodies are really the data disposable upon which technologies are practiced and perfected. And by that I mean I'm going to show you some examples tonight of technologies that maybe we might not know about had it not been for the way Black bodies and Black people were used or engaged with some of those technologies. One of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is the way in which people who are most vulnerable in society are often the people through which these kinds of technologies, digital technologies and platforms are practicing really for the purpose of datafying every dimension of our lives and extracting profit from that. And so some of that we're going to spend some time unpacking. Now, let me say, I know that when I'm in Europe, everybody's always like, we don't have racism in Europe, so I'm just going to make eye contact with all the black people right now and be like, is that right? See, they're giving me back the face like, no, girl, don't believe that. So I know better. But I do want you to try to stay with me. So I'm going to give us at least a little bit of a common framework, and you can go and read more about this if you're interested. In the context of the United States, one of the ways that we talk about racialization is through the racial binary. Vilna Bashi-Treitler, who is a professor, she's the chair of Black Studies at UC Santa Barbara, is an amazing scholar. She wrote a very important book called The Ethnic Project. And in that, she did an ethnography of many different ethnic groups and their kind of experience of immigrating to the United States and also kind of their contemporary cultural experiences. And what she found is that the racial binary between kind of the constructions of whiteness and what whiteness affords people in society, as well as the way in which blackness have been constructed, are the binaries through which all ethnicities come to figure out their place in the U.S. And we might argue that this could be extended to other areas. One of the things that we see and how this works in a kind of legal and social framework is that, for example, some ethnic groups will immigrate to the U.S. and then petition for whiteness, for the status of being recognized as white, right? And part of how they do that, and this was especially potent, excuse me, during the period of segregation, really from kind of Reconstruction up through the Civil Rights Movement, was people did not want to not be afforded civil and human rights. And they clearly understood that black bodies and African people of African descent, were the people for whom all rights, in essence, were denied. And so this idea of kind of leveraging off of anti-blackness has been a very potent way that Bashi-Treitler writes about how the process of racialization happens. And I think we could argue that this happens. And so this is one of the phenomena where you see, for example, European immigrants to the U.S. over the last 100 years who come, when they arrive, they're Italian or they're Irish. And then through a series of generations, within just a generation or two, they become white, right? And what that means is they petition for the kind of rights and kind of social value that's meted out to people who kind of phenotypically fit into this kind of social category. Now, this is really important because this process of racialization that we kind of need to understand is the kind of reality, it's the sociological landscape. And yet in Silicon Valley, where a lot of the technologies that we're engaging with are kind of emanating from, there's been a powerful and a kind of potent backlash against talking about and thinking about race. Now, this isn't just in Silicon Valley. This is kind of really, since the 1990s, kind of been the backlash or kind of racist response to identity politics or organizing around kind of the cultural and shared ethnic interests that many of us have. And the backlash to that has really come forward in colorblind ideology. So this might be a place where we can pick up and find something in common, because I find that when I talk to people outside of the US, they understand colorblind ideology, which is to say this idea that we don't see race. We don't have a race problem. We don't see race. See, these guys are like, they're smirking. They're like, yeah, I know. I've heard it before. You've heard it a couple times. Yeah. So colorblind ideology is really about kind of the inappropriateness of seeing race. And what you'll find over and over, one of the things I talk about in the book is the way in which, for example, venture capitalists in Silicon Valley will talk about the need to be colorblind or gender blind in their funding of new ventures in the Valley. And of course, weirdly, colorblindness somehow, by being colorblind and gender blind, means that we mostly only fund white and Asian men's projects. So it's weird. That's like the only color that can't be seen. and the only gender that can't be seen is men, and white and Asian men in particular. And so this idea of that the people who are marked, who are racialized, are the people that we can't see is actually a really fundamental part, I think, of the orientation that pervades many companies, and one of the reasons why we have a lot of the failures that we're going to see here tonight. It also makes it, the language of colorblind ideology, which, there's great research around colorblindness. Michael Brown wrote a great book. He's a professor at Berkeley. Helen Neville, who writes from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. What they all find is that people who embrace this kind of colorblind ideology are more likely to allow racism in their presence, because to even acknowledge it for them somehow creates a contradiction, that if we acknowledge these problems, we in fact are ourselves the problem. So I want to challenge us then in this context of racialization that has happened historically in the United States for more than 300 years, and the kind of racist response to the civil rights movement, which has really emerged as an embracing of colorblind ideology, that this has happened and kind of come into being at a moment when we have civil rights legislation that's allowing, for the first time en masse, women and people of color to participate in decision making. So in the 1960s, at the very moment that we have civil rights legislation passed, and we can en masse enfranchise people of color, historically underrepresented, which is typically Black, Latino, Indigenous, Native American, and women, Pacific Islanders for sure, into management positions, into decision-making positions. At that moment in the 1960s is when we also start to see the rise of computerization and the ideology and the notion that computers can make better decisions than people. So weird that at the moment we try to get a multiracial democracy rolling, computers can do society better. And the people who are designing those technologies take us back to a very kind of narrow population who gets to participate. All right, so this is one of the things that I think is part of what I might argue is a bit of like a technological redlining process. Redlining is the process of kind of just openly discriminating. For example, you come from a particular zip code. Let's say you live in my zip code, which is a predominantly African-American neighborhood. You pay more for insurance, car insurance, homeowners insurance, and so forth. That's been outlawed as a practice because that was, of course, something that many industries took advantage of because of racial segregation. What we're starting to see, I think, is a kind of new forms of technological redlining, where certain bits and profiles are being developed about us, in fact, profiles that are incredibly difficult for us to intervene upon, and these now stand as kind of a proxy for who we really are. In fact, Farida invited me to an event last year where we did this amazing, I see her baby responded when I said her mom's name. I love that, the connection is strong. So we did an interview at the Big Boulder Initiative, and one of the things that was interesting there is right before we were on, I think it was the director of the FBI, or CIA, which is like kind of, so it was the CIA director, Simon was there. So CIA director is on stage, and he says that our data profile, not his, so not that our including his, but our, the rest of us, data profiles are who we are. I know it's like super scary to imagine that everywhere we've been, everything we've done on the internet is who we are in the eyes of the CIA. So that's something that, again, we might want to think about as we move forward with our technological engagements. But of course, one of the things that I try to take up in the book is, what does it mean to have a data profile that one can never intervene upon, right? So that not only are people the subjects of these platforms, but we are also engaged with them in ways that exacerbate whatever our kind of current station is in life. And I think that these are going to be really important issues. I certainly often say that I think artificial intelligence is a 21st century human rights issue, and it's going to be the kind of thing that we're going to have to take up in a serious way. And we truly don't have the legal and social frameworks for thinking about what those rights could be and should be. And so it's an incredibly important moment. Now, I want to give a quick, this is going to be like super quick, history lesson. I just want to give you a little bit of some names of people that I want you to kind of have in mind. And one of the reasons why I'm sharing, here we have Timnit Gebru, who works in the Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics group, and she's the founder of Blacks in AI, who are doing important work to center, again, the kind of disparate impacts of AI on Black people. Joy Bual, I always butcher her name, and I know she hates me. Buwamini at the MIT lab has done important work, for example, on facial recognition. You may have seen her. She was on. Do you guys get Last Week Tonight with John Oliver here? You gotta Hulu that or something, like stream it, because it's really good. So she was there, and they did a story on her research where she's trying to get recognized by the camera. It's like the racist soap dispenser. The facial recognition doesn't see you. Then she takes the white mask and she puts like literally a white mask on, and then it reads her perfectly. And then she takes it off and like, I'm not here anymore. And then she puts it on, hi, I'm here. Okay, so she does this amazing work at the MIT Media Lab. And I think, again, she's really a smart, important person for you to know about. She's organized this algorithmic Avengers group to really cultivate. It's kind of difficult because the Avengers right now, I'm not going to ruin it for you, but let's just say it's a difficult metaphor right now. We need the next film out. So she's doing good work to kind of raise popular awareness and response. And then, of course, Charlton McElwain at NYU, who's doing important work looking at how the internet, for example, is as segregated as a city. And so again, these things are important because they disrupt this notion that the internet is just a free-flowing space, it's fully democratic, everybody has the same experience, and you could experience it any way you want. And of course, I'm tremendously inspired here in the UK by Professor Farida Vies and Dr. Ramon Amaro. I think they're both asking really important critical questions, again, centering critically kind of the power relationship that digital media has to our everyday lives. And these are some other people that, if you're interested, it's funny, I was sharing earlier today, I was kind of at a talk with a few friends, and, now everyone's talking about ethics and AI. And I can tell you, I'm here to report out, that hasn't been the common conversation. In fact, I remember when I was first writing this book, and I'm coming after people like Craig Watkins, Anna Everett, Rayvon Fouché, who've been writing critically about technology and the Black experience for many, many years before me. Alondra Nelson, of course, who's a dean at Columbia, writing about kind of DNA and genomics and the discriminatory ways in which those data practices are underway. Andre Brock, who's at the University of Michigan, I think he's on his way to Georgia Tech. I don't know if I was supposed to announce that online. It's fine. Yeah, he's going to Georgia Tech. He's amazing and incredible, and he's going to see, these things are like they catch you off guard because then you realize you're streaming. He's written, if you've ever heard of the phenomenon called Black Twitter, then you know Andre Brock because he really wrote the first academic paper about that, and how Black people, I remember I've been on Twitter for a long time. I've been on so long that I actually have the handle @Safiya. Can you believe that? I can't use it because every Safiya in the world somehow comes into that, so then it's like not useful, but I do have it. And I can remember, for example, and Andre writes about when people in Silicon Valley, they had Twitter so they could talk among themselves, and then they'd come back to work the next morning, and these trending hashtags were happening, and they were all the interests of young Black teenagers, and everyone was like, what just happened? And there was, these interesting early stories about Twitter where the Silicon Valley elite would complain that Black kids were using Twitter wrong. So thanks, Black kids, because they gave us trending hashtags. Okay, so these are some things that we don't know, but he's written about that. Simone Brown, of course, writing about dark matters and surveillance, and Dorothy Roberts about, kind of the fatal invention and the intersection of race and science. I share these with you because what I find it many times is that people don't know that there's this kind of rich legacy of work. This is just scratching the surface. I mean, to me, these are key people who stand out for me, but they are people who've been helping, again, to make this conversation about ethics and science, or ethics and technology, quite mainstream now. And I think we have to know, mainly because it's, it's like the word intersectionality. No one knows that came from, Black feminist theorists in law schools, Kimberly Crenshaw and Cheryl Harris and others who have really been erased from these histories of again, centering the most vulnerable. And this is the tradition that I find myself in. All right, so why study Google and its digital failures? All right, well, first of all, the main reason is, now I gotta take my jacket off because I'm getting hot. So you know that the Pew Internet and American Life Project, they do a study on search engine use. And they, in 2012, they did an update to their search engine user use study. They've done 2 so far. I'm just gonna throw that there. One in 2005 and one in 2012. Okay, so here are the headlines that you really need to know about. This is from the latest search engine use study, and this is just, again, in the US context. Over 60 million Americans engaged in search, and for the most part, people report that they're satisfied with the results they find in search. Pew reports that 73% of all Americans have used a search engine. 59% report using a search engine every day, and I think we can feel confident that we're up from that. 83% of search engine users use Google. So that's why I study Google. People are always like, why don't you study Bing and Yahoo? And I'm like, because no one is using them. You're not even using them. Why are you asking? You know. So you have to study the monopoly leader, because really everyone else is trying to be like the monopoly leader. Now, especially alarming is the way that search engines are increasingly positioned as a trusted public good. According to Pew, users report generally good outcomes and relatively high confidence in the capabilities of search engines. 73% of search engine users say that most or all of the information they find as they use search engines is accurate and trustworthy. 73%. I see there's a woman over here, she's like, it's like, right, because not you, you know better, you weren't in that 73%. But this is, so everybody outside this room, if we had a sample like us, it would be everybody else who thinks that this is a fair, and accurate, and trustworthy. 66% of search engine users say search engines are a fair and unbiased source of information. Now, what got me off on this? I was thinking about these issues of fairness and accuracy and trustworthy. I did my PhD in the Library and Information Science program. I went to the iSchool at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. At the time that I started graduate school, I had just left the advertising industry, and everyone was talking about Google like it was the new public library. All the universities were kind of underway with the Google Book Digitization Project. Remember that? Blast from the past. Since most universities have pulled out of it, but a lot of universities were deeply invested in that, handing over thousands and thousands of volumes to Google to digitize. And people were really seeing Google as like the people's portal. Now, again, I'm old, so I remember what it was like when you were trying to go through the directories to find a good coffee shop in Manchester. Yeah, like hell you are. That's not going to happen. I mean, we know what Google has provided us, what search engines have afforded us to not have to go through elaborate directories to find information. But what we've also lost in many cases is highly curated content by experts, by deep subject matter experts. And so this became incredibly potent to me when I started. I was having a conversation with my colleague Andre Brock, who I mentioned does the work on Black Twitter, and I said, I'm going to write about Google for my dissertation, and he said, yeah, just off the cuff, he's like, yeah, you should see what happens when you Google black girls. And I was like, what happens? And he was like, just don't do it on the university network. And I was like, I hate you. And then I went home. Okay, so for many years, starting in 2009, when you did a query on the keywords black girls, 80% of what showed up on the first page was pornography. Now, there's kids present, mainly mine, so I'm not going to read what's happening here, but you can take a look. And really, so here, okay, this is the question I finally have been dying to ask because I've never been in the UK to get to ask it. Okay, so you see the first site is a porn site. The second one is a UK band of white guys called the Black Girls. I want to know who knows who the Black Girls are. Not even in the UK, one person. I asked this question all over the world, who knows who the Black Girls are? And everyone's like, no, not even in Manchester. Shame on you, Black Girls. All right, so Black Girls, amazing at search engine optimization, terrible at music distribution. Established. I said it right here. Okay, followed by a porn site, porn site, porn site. Black Girls UK band Facebook page, winning. Porn site, blog. Okay. I wrote about this in kind of an academic piece, and then I wrote about how the same logics that are at play here around kind of optimizing content, how it is that the porn industry, for example, who has, it has a lot of money, it's able to co-opt and optimize certain keywords, and it does that, and it does it quite brilliantly, and it really did that up until about, this article first came out in Bitch magazine in 2012, and by the fall, this came out in the spring. By the fall, Google had really suppressed a lot of the porn, and so you couldn't find that. But again, one of the things that I've noticed over time, because I've been following search for a long time, is that when there's a lot of public outcry, then tweaks are made quietly, and so the public outcry is important. I wrote about how those same logics of optimization and kind of the commercialization of information was also at play in the 2016 presidential election for the Chronicle of Higher Ed. Now, these ideas about kind of these stereotypes of the hypersexualized girl are not new. These are old media stereotypes. In the US, for example, like some of these images, these are from the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia at Ferris University, which is an amazing collection that really counter-narrates the history of racist imagery of African Americans. And by counter-narrates, I mean that this type of imagery in some quarters might be considered like Americana. You might find it at a county fair, for example. Maybe you'd find it in your parents' or your grandparents' basement or attic or something in a box. This is a postcard, for example, from the Jim Crow era of a black girl child who is kind of in this, unclothed, hiding her privates. You maybe can't see that, but the top says, "Honey, I'm waiting for you." So this idea, this kind of gross sexualization of black girls and black children and black women has served a very important historical narrative. Now, in the US context, for a long time, the image and the idea of black women, this is just about kind of one stereotype. For a long time, the stereotype was of black women as kind of mammies. And this idea that black women really, what we really wanted was to, wet nurse other people's children, take care of other people's children, live in the house, and be completely stripped of all of our rights and somehow enjoy that, right? To be enslaved and taking care of white Americans was really a very powerful, popular narrative, and which really served the notion that black women enjoyed this. Black people enjoyed being enslaved. So you have to have cultural stereotypes in order to justify particular kinds of social and economic policy. And so that was a very potent one. At the point in history when the enslavement of African people is outlawed, the only way that you can reproduce the slave labor force is through reproduction. If black women give birth to children, those children are born into enslavement. And then we have the rise of the hypersexualized black woman. That stereotype exists strictly to, again, justify that black women being forced to have many, 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 many children is because they just love sex, not because they're reproducing the labor force for those who own them and for the broader society under kind of racialized capitalism. So these images are old media images and old media ideas that get reproduced into what we found kind of in these ideas about the hypersexualized woman. And, you know, Latinas and Asian girls don't fare much better. Google has kind of quietly suppressed the porn when it comes to the images of black women, black girls. And of course, you know, when I say black girls, I actually mean those were searches on black girls. I was thinking about my daughter at the time, my bonus daughter, you know, my stepdaughter. She was a tween at the time that I started this research. And all those sites that I showed you, those are women. So at a fundamental kind of sexism 101, women get coded as girls, right? And named and coded and related to as girls. So none of this content is about children or young girls. They don't really have a space to be seen in search. Asian girls, almost exclusively porn, same with Latina girls. Now, there are other types of failures that happen over and over, and I'll try to kind of quickly move through these. Here's a story that went viral on the Washington Post, picked it up, and as did a number, U.S. News and World Report. What was happening, DeRay McKesson, who's kind of a well-known, I characterize him as a well-known Twitter celebrity because he became well-known around the time that Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri by a police officer, Darren Wilson, and he really rose to prominence because Beyonce followed him. So I always feel compelled to say, if anyone here knows Beyonce and you could get her to follow me, it would really amplify the work. Just really get it out there, you know, I mean, strictly for the work. Okay, so DeRay becomes kind of an overnight person because, of course, everybody who follows Beyonce is going to follow who she follows. And DeRay tweeted out, if you Google map the N-word house, this is what you'll find, America. And what was happening during the presidency of Barack Obama is that if you went to Google Maps and you typed in the N-word king or the N-word house, Google Maps would take you to the White House. This is during, again, Barack Obama's presidency. And the response was quite a typical Google response. It's actually not just Google. I mean, many big tech companies, this is typically their response, which is some inappropriate results are surfacing. They should not be. We apologize for any offense this may have caused. Which is always like, that may have caused? I mean, like, should that not, like, maybe it got, you know, like, I don't know. Is it, like, controversial? It was offensive. You could just say, we apologize, we've really offended everyone with this. Our teams are working to fix this issue quickly. And this is a very kind of typical characterization, which is it's a glitch in an otherwise perfectly seamless and smooth operating system. And I think these are the kinds of things that scholars like Lisa Nakamura and Wendy Chun and others have really tried to call out, which is that these are not glitches in the system. These are very typical. And when you start looking at them in MASH and start really trying to aggregate a lot of them, you start to see troubling trends. Here's Kabir Ali. He's searching for 3 black teenagers. This is a story that got picked up by USA Today. His friends are videoing him. He's like, let's see what happens when I do an image search on 3 black teenagers. What comes up? Almost exclusively mugshots of black teens. And then he says, let's see what happens when we change one word. He says, let's change black to white. And then we get these like weird stock photography of white kids playing multiple sports at one time. But it's awkward. It's like a soccer and a football and a basketball. Okay, so that's all happening together. And, this is, again, a way to characterize some of the tensions that exist in the way that race gets constructed in these platforms. Now, the next day, thank goodness, Bob's Burgers Guy notices that Google has just quietly changed the algorithm. And again, this is one of the ways that this happens. So the next day, we just added a picture of a young white man who's being criminally sentenced. I looked this image up. This is actually a young man who's being, he's on trial. He was on trial at the time for a hate crime of killing an African-American man. And then Google has kind of like slipped in some some girls playing volleyball or something on like a church youth group. I don't know what's happening. All right, so this is again, these subtle kinds of tweaks that happen that we see over time. This is one of my favorite kind of failures. This is a tweet that went viral. When you did a Google image search on unprofessional hairstyles for work, you got exclusively black women with natural hair. And when you changed it to professional hairstyles for women, you got exclusively white women with ponytails and updos. So I always wear my unprofessional hairstyle to work for you, and I feel like that's just the hairstyle I wear every day. So this is a really interesting kind of characterization. I often tell my girlfriends who are white that it's the ponytail and the updo that really makes them professional, and they need to note that as well as being white. So, all right. Jessica Davis and Oscar Gandy have written, if you're interested in these phenomena and why they're so important, excuse me, these media representations really reflect kind of the ways in which social policy comes into being, because we're deeply reliant upon stereotypes to help us decide who's worthy and who isn't of resources in our society. If you go back to Bashi Treitler, right, arguing in the racial binary. And so media studies scholars are really important and have done a lot of important work over time to help us do the sense making of why these stereotypes are so incredibly dangerous. It's just not sufficient to say, well, we know that these are stereotypes that are happening. Those stereotypes become really important and real, especially when, I'll tell you, I talk to teachers in training all the time, and I can't tell you how many times they feel mortified that they've been telling their students to just Google it for years, right? And sending K through 12 age young people to Google to do sense-making work for them. Now, right after, there was a great study that was done in 2013 by Epstein and Robertson, and they found that democracy was at risk because manipulating search rankings could shift voters' preferences substantially without their awareness. So they did a controlled study, and what they found is that if they showed people favorable articles about someone running for office, people said they'd vote for them. And if they showed them negative articles, web links on the first page, people said they would not vote for that person. Now, they were really adamant, and I can remember in 2013 when I was talking about the book and I was talking about their study, and they were saying, they were really issuing the warning that search engines need to be regulated because they have such a potent effect on democracy. And it was like a foreshadowing of the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Because what actually happened, as we all know now, is that there was plenty of disinformation that was moving through digital media platforms, from Facebook to YouTube, Google, Twitter. But even the week following the U.S. presidential election, which, as you may or may not know, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. We have this hideous thing called the Electoral College that just screws us, basically. That's just like the quick way of describing it. And when you did a search for Google for final election results, it took you to a disinformation site that said that Donald Trump won the popular vote, which is just not fake news, and it's not an alternative fact. It's just a lie. It's not true. And it's very important, that we kind of understand this as disinformation rather than fake news. I've really just started to become much more thoughtful about being clear about what disinformation is and the role that it plays, certainly in undermining democracy, and that's really important. That's not just about a kind of a subjective point of view in news media. Here in the UK, it's been interesting because you might remember this was in Germany. I think where the story first broke. This idea that Boasian anthropology had kind of been co-opted by white nationalists or white power organizers online. And when we've seen white supremacists and white nationalists, white power organizers and sympathizers online who co-opt certain kinds of keywords. Often the response is, again, quite typical coming from Google, which is when Sergey Brin's asked about adjusting the algorithm to prevent white supremacists from taking over certain keywords, he says that would be bad technology practice. An important part of our values as a company is that we don't edit the search results. What our algorithms produce, whether we like it or not, are the search results. I think people want to know we have unbiased search results. I can barely read it without laughing. Except for when we're in Germany and France, where it's against the law to traffic in anti-Semitic content. And Google, Amazon, eBay, all of the platforms heavily curate with what my colleague Sarah Roberts calls commercial content moderators. They have all kinds of software and flagging systems and human beings who are moderating and making sure that anti-Semitic and hate content can't proliferate in their platforms. So this idea, again, that's facing us in the US is often that nothing can be done, it's bad technology practice to edit or bias the search results. And because that undermines the notion that tech platforms are simply platforms and not responsible for the content that moves through them. In the US, you're accountable by law for, if you're a media producer, to certain different standards than you are if you are simply a tech company and you're not responsible for the content. And so it's really important that we think about what's happening in the content that's moving through these platforms and how they're regulated differently in different parts of the world. I recently wrote a piece for Time Magazine that tech companies really have been slow to respond to the way that their platforms have been used to amplify hate. Of course, anonymity in social media often makes it difficult to identify right-wing radicalization that's happening online. But again, exposing all kinds of users to violent and racist disinformation. And one of the things that I really think that we need to talk about, and we need to talk with you and others in the I can't even say others in the EU anymore, you guys, but you know what I meant. I had to catch myself. We need to be talking with our colleagues outside of the United States about the regulatory frameworks and how we protect people, again, who I think are most vulnerable in these platforms. Now, one of the challenges is that I think, we have these kind of many dimensions of troubled practice that, again, gets practiced on vulnerable people. So whether it's medicine, for example, that has used black bodies for hundreds of years to kind of perfect its science, anthropology, certainly I think even around technology, that there's been this kind of troubled relationship. And of course, part of it is that we have these seemingly progressive technological narratives that Rayvon Fouché talks about, as if technology is always about a forward motion of progress, right? And that it isn't, in fact, predicated upon this kind of predatory relationship to vulnerable people. I thought it was interesting to see, for example, kind of the things that have been coming out since Google kind of changed its algorithm and suppressed the content, the pornographic content around black girls. We've started to see, for example, Google became a sponsor of Black Girls Code. And, that's just like the perfect, in my mind, but the perfect neoliberal co-optation, which is to sponsor Black Girls Code and then move them into the office. And now when you do a search on black girls, you get Black Girls Code first. And this idea, right, of kind of subsuming people who are trying to speak back to what tech companies have done and the ways in which they've practiced exclusion is really quite interesting because, Black Girls Code is, of course, designed to get young Black and African American girls interested into coding and technology. But this dialogue now has almost come to be that if black girls had actually known how to code, then they wouldn't have had these problems. So now I guess 5 and 6-year-old Black girls are responsible for what the output of platforms, because they haven't been at the table and the pipeline is non-existent, and all of this, like, there's a lot of great research about how there is an incredibly diverse pipeline, despite what you may get here in the news and coming out of the Valley. And so it's been important, I think, and interesting to listen to and focus on what some of these interventions have been. Here I think of my friend and colleague Heather Hiles, who was a Black woman who's raised more venture capital in Silicon Valley than any other Black woman in the history of Silicon Valley. And even still, she's saying that less than 1% of venture capital in the United States is invested in Black women. And so, when we think about what it would take to intervene, it's going to take more than just teaching the 5 and 10-year-old girls how to code, when we're talking about these highly, deeply capitalized systems that, in fact, profit off of these kinds of practices that I'm talking about tonight. So, one thing that I would be remiss if I didn't just mention, and I'm starting some new work this summer in Ghana looking at e-waste cities down here. You can see, a lot of my concern has been about representation, because I think representation is a way in for talking about the kind of complexities of the kind of tech media industries. But all of these technologies are resting quite precariously on extraction of minerals in the global south, and of course a phenomenal amount of waste and e-waste that comes from our digital technology engagements. And again, one of the things that I'm trying to do, the foray of talking about Black girls in the book was really to say, here's something we can understand. We understand how a system of racism and sexism work. Let me give you an example to show you in a very clear illustration how the phenomena of oppression and exploitation kind of manifests in these companies. It's an entry point. I'm trying to also, in my next bit of work, talk about the mineral extraction and the hidden labor that's involved in, like, the iPhone 17 or whatever we're going to be on in a week. These are, to me, part of the troubled notion of the infinite linear progress of our technologies, and that they are infinite, and of course the datafication of everything and the digitization of everything. For those of us coming out of the field of library science, is it's something to be concerned about. If I pass you this book, it could pass around, this knowledge could pass around until it doesn't, until the pages fall out. But I can't do that same thing on my Kindle. I can't give it to you, right? I can't give you the digital in quite the same way. And so when we talk about the truncation of knowledge, one of the things that I think we have to really care about is that all forms of knowledge be so deeply embedded into the digital. Not just in terms of Google search, but I certainly think that given that the public is highly reliant upon it for their knowledge, we should certainly care. But that just means, again, more extraction, more disposal, and the environmental effects of this are for another talk at another time. The last thing I guess I'll just kind of start to close here with is that, when I think about, when I was talking about algorithms and AI in the book, I was really trying to get at not only how biased data sets can be, and how, of course, that is the data that we use to train machines when we start talking about machine learning and so-called deep learning, but that they're also coming to be embodied in new forms of hardware. So we have a whole new kind of acculturation. I love the memes that are going around about how, back in the day, we would never let the FBI just come into our house and just sit and listen to everything we do. But now we just have Alexa just sitting there, just listening, doing whatever she's doing. But the gendered dimensions of whether it's avatars, right, kind of virtual assistants like Miss Dewey, or these kind of seemingly benign, again, home devices that are gendered. I was with a great group of roboticist professors at Stanford a couple of months ago, and they were talking even about what they're noticing with children, for example, shouting commands at Siri and Alexa. Siri, get me blah, 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 Alexa, get me yada, yada, and how they really had not thought about the socialization that's underway with kids who are now being acculturated to shouting commands at a woman's voice or at a seemingly female, right, virtual assistant or kind of robots. And so I think that will be a whole new interesting area of research that I hope someone will take up. Certainly predictive policing and other types of software are the kinds of things that become very easy to understand practices where you have data sets that are, and this is something I love Simone Brown's work around race and surveillance. You have a long storied histories of racialized surveillance in the form of policing, and that becomes the allegedly neutral data sets that inform predictive policing. So if you have, for example, a history of over-policing, over-ticketing, and so forth in an area, then that will be your baseline of new knowledge that feeds into new predictive policing software and technologies. We used to live in Champaign, Illinois, and my husband will remember that in one part of town that was the historically African-American part of town, there were no sidewalks for the most part in those neighborhoods. And guess what? Kids got ticketed all of the time for jaywalking because they had to walk in the street because there were no sidewalks. So think about that as a data set for the police department in Champaign, Illinois, as a kind of like, here's a hot spot of criminal activity. The jaywalkers, you better get them, right? I mean, it's just, it's frightening, I think, to think about, and we see all kinds of new projects that are emerging that are, I think, things we need to care about. When I was, looking at even in YouTube, just kind of the ways, the commodification of black bodies, and again, I think this is something that is interesting to think about. Here you have the most popular item from a Google video search on the keywords Eric Garner. Eric Garner was an African-American man who was selling loose cigarettes in New York and was choked to death by NYPD. He's kind of well known, in memoriam for his last words being, "I can't breathe." And when you do this video search on Eric Garner, you get, ads literally running over the top of the video of him being choked to death. And so I think these are the kinds of things that are worth, again, exploring. How does this commodification happen? How are these ideas used as just kind of the fodder for capitalism in the US? Now, what are the things that we can do? I always feel obliged to give us things we can do, even though, I wanted to say that these things are not easy to do. I think first we need to reclaim this idea of the public and what public interest platforms could look like. It's difficult in some places because the convergence of the state and multinational corporations has become so powerful kind of under neoliberal economic policies that it's very difficult, I think, to imagine what public interest or highly democratized platforms could look like that aren't kind of built to run on advertising revenues. The reason that we see some of these things is because they're tittillating. Those videos, they circulate, they go viral, people click on them, even people who disagree with the content and want to know about these horrible tragedies of police brutality still feed kind of the economic engine of how these platforms work. So I think we need to be thinking about non-commercial platforms and repositories. Certainly we need to resist the kind of colorblind, racist, and sexist technology development, which is easier said than done, but I do think we've got to nuance and complexify the way that we talk about how we develop our technologies. If anything, we can understand the binary in tech design, right? So how is the racial binary so difficult, right, to extrapolate and put into there's some logics that I think we could have in common to talk about and complexify the way we develop technologies, and including maybe not developing some technologies. One of the things that's troubling, I kind of jumped over this, but it's interesting to see, like, for example, the first wave of kind of mass commercial robots that we're starting to see are sex dolls, right? And I always think, like, why didn't we get the doll that was going to answer my email? Because I'm drowning in email. Nobody wants to make the tech or the robot that will make women's lives easier. Yeah, I don't know, right? So it's like, what gets invested in and why and for whom? Who's the imagined audience for this incredible amount of capitalization that I think we need to care about for sure. Certainly reducing the tech overdevelopment and e-waste. I mean, in many situations, we're seeing the tech ideas go straight from a university R&D lab or a private industry lab straight to market. And there's really no stopping point for us to debate whether we want these things or not. And I think for those who again, are most likely to be crushed and made disposable and have their lives deeply complicated by things like AI, we need to think about whether we even want these projects. And if we don't, how would we ever opt out? How could we ever refuse them? Making information research visible to the public, I think that's something we all understand. And ultimately, I think we can never give up. It's really crucial. We have more data and technology than ever, but we also have more social, political, and economic inequality and injustice to go with it. You had this amazing study that just came out last month that is projecting that by 2030, 1% will own 2/3 of the world's wealth. 1% will own 2/3 of the world's wealth by 2030. What I see on the horizon is intensified datafication, increased devices, more technology, with the promise that it will somehow solve our problems. And yet here we are. We have more tech than ever, and we also have more injustice and inequality to go with it. So what's the relationship here? I said for the first time a couple days ago, it's interesting to think about these like new markets for capital going in the direction of the digital and AI. And, we can't eat the digital. We're not going to be able to make a iPhone sandwich. I mean, the truth of in fact, I said that to somebody the other day and they were like, that I watch videos of people eating. And I was like, this is what I'm talking about. Do you see what I'm saying? Is that the project? We'll get to watch other people eating well while we drink Soylent or something? I don't know. It's troubling, again, to think about where the investments will go and how might we think about reframing some of that. So I think I'll leave it there and just say thank you so much for your attention. I really enjoyed it.
A huge thank you to Safiya for this super engaging talk. So we have about 10-15 minutes for questions before we have the drink reception. So who has the first question, please?
This is a talk that needs drinks to follow it. I recognize that.
So, yeah, I'm going to pass the mic.
Do you think that capitalism itself is an algorithm of oppression?
Yes, of course. Yes. Capitalism itself is an algorithm of oppression. And, I would say racialized capitalism because that's really all we know, right? I mean, it is a racialized project and we see all the effects of the, uneven investments and exploitation all over the world. I mean, of course, when we think about how will the 1% own 2/3 of the world's wealth? Like, how would that happen? And how much is going to be taken, quite frankly? I mean, we just had last year the largest transfer of public wealth, public assets to the private sector in the history of the United States. I mean, that's intense. And when the recession hit, when we had the kind of mortgage crisis and the real estate kind of foreclosure crisis in the U.S. kind of kicking off around 2006, that was the largest wipeout of black wealth in the history of the United States. So all the gains of Reconstruction, all the gains of civil rights, basically anything that my grandparents had been able to do in owning a home, wiped out, right? So this is one of the reasons why, I think we have to trouble what's happening and how it happens, and certainly the financial models that came straight out of Wall Street, quite frankly, and Cathy O'Neill talks about this in her book, Weapons of Mass Destruction. That gamification of financial models coming out of Wall Street was like the playground. It was the perfecting. And where did it happen? It happened on poor people. That's where it was practiced. And those people were people of color, Black and Latino, primarily in the U.S. So for sure.
There's
yes.
a question there in the back. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Audre Lorde said the master's tools can destroy the master's house. Should we be encouraging people to disconnect? What consequences does that have?
No, I should come back to work here tomorrow.
I mean, should we be problematizing sort of the social media? I mean, I think your answer is yes, but I'm curious about, do you think that's a valid course of action to take people's iPhones out of their hand and say, these are the master's tools?
I think it cannot be remedied at an individual level in that way, quite frankly. And I say this the same about Facebook. Like, it's cute for people to talk about, I'm going to delete Facebook. And the privileged few will be able to do that. But for everyone else, for most of the world that engages with Facebook, it's the only internet they know. So I don't think that solving these at an individual, delete or get off the grid, is actually going to solve it. Much the way, if I stop paying my rent, I'm not taking down capitalism. Do you see what I'm saying? It's just not, it doesn't work like that. So I think we have to figure out, one thing we could do is we could really strengthen things in the sector we're in. So why not think about, for example, fair sourcing, what is really happening around the sourcing of materials, what's happening with disposal. I often will hold this up for my computer science students who take classes from me, and I'll say, okay, you want a design challenge? Design this where no one dies. And then they have to really unpack the politics of it to even understand what am I talking about. And then there's some weeping, some tears flow, and then we get it back together. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that I think it's systemic design is part of what we're talking about. Certainly the types of investments that are made. I think we've got to have a more powerful, organized public response. All of our mechanisms for organizing response in the U.S. have almost been completely eviscerated. We used to have more than 80% of the labor force in the U.S. was coming out of World War II was in a labor union. And now we have something I just heard on the radio, about 15% of the labor force in the U.S. is unionized. So this makes it difficult, and this is again where we get back to these kind of neoliberal individual ideas about what's my personal responsibility, but I think it's about other responses that are large and systemic and that cause structural shift. And I don't think that means every single person will be in the street over it necessarily. I was just sharing earlier with Bex when we were recording a podcast before this, and I was saying, the civil rights movement in the United States, everybody now in retrospect was at the march with Dr. King. Do you know what I'm saying? Everybody was I marched with King. But really they didn't. They were get out of the streets, stop it. They had derision toward the civil rights movement, much like many people deride the Black Lives Matter movement right now. It was really only 10% of the community that was out really organizing. So I think we just need to find our 10% too as a response.
I saw two questions. There was a question there, and then the final one here. So, yeah.
Do you want the mic? Yeah, come on.
Hello, my name is Kirsty. So I just want to share an observation. So I was purchasing some home insurance for my grandma. She lives like 20 minutes away. But at the same time, me and my girlfriend did the same search. She's white, I'm from Express. I'm not saying that's any different. We've got a similar earning, with similar amounts, and we've probably got similar credit rating. But when she searched for the home insurance, hers was significantly cheaper than mine. I was searching the same address and the same person, and I think that like it's happening very regularly. You know, car insurance, everything. It's like the policy premium is keeping people divided, and I just I don't know how we can stop it. I'm not sure how we can do it. Do you think that saying that it's because we've not got enough black coders and enough minorities coding? Do you think if we did flood the market with those coders that they could have an impact? I know you mentioned it before, but do you think that visibility might have an impact?
Okay, so I mean that's a perfect example of the kind of data discrimination that I'm talking about that we can't see. And this is, I think, this is a place we have to have public policy because, if the bank discriminates, doesn't give us a mortgage, and it's the banker, and it's 1950, we know what's going on. We have not very good recourse. When you start divorcing the decision-making from a human being, because, most of our discrimination laws are about proving intent. I have to prove the baker was a racist because he's got like a history of racism and which is impossible, and now I'm getting like a forensic investigator to figure this out, right? So I can prove, and that's incredibly difficult, which is one of the reasons why most people don't really get very good redress around racial discrimination even now. When we start talking about no human being and software or AI involved in making the decision, it gets even harder because now we don't have a human being to even talk about intent with. And we have a very powerful discourse that the technology is just a tool, that it's neutral, it can't have intent. And then we also have to push that boulder up a hill too when we're making these kinds of claims. So we don't have, this is what I mean, we don't have a legal and social regulatory framework or legal framework to even tackle the kind of discrimination. And I think it's also very difficult. I would think from your work too, Frida, that you would know that it's really difficult for people to even know what their data profiles are in these platforms. So I don't really know how I can encode it. We have interesting little case studies. There was an African American man in Atlanta. He had an 800 credit score. His dad was a financial planner. He became a second generation financial planner. This guy's like the perfect human being apparently. Never done a single thing wrong, whatever that means, in his entire life. He's on his honeymoon, goes to use his Amex. His Amex is getting declined. His credit line's been cut in half. He gets back, he's calling, this was on the news. He's calling, he's again, forensic accounting, every single thing. Finally, after multiple phone calls with Amex, trying to understand what happened, he discovers only one charge in months of using his Amex, where he was across town visiting some relatives on the lower income side of Atlanta, and he ran into Walmart to get something for someone. And he swiped his Amex at the Walmart. And just like that, he was profiled as non-creditworthy because apparently people who shop at Walmart, according to Amex's algorithm, don't pay their bills. So that's the kind of the datafication of our every move that we cannot, none of us, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands how many people really go through their bank statements carefully, okay? But I'm going to say that it's highly likely that a lot of people cannot track all of the moves that they have made and the way their tech has been engaged that's building their data profiles that would land us with these kinds of cases over and over again. And those are the kinds of things I think we absolutely have to have policy on. We cannot trust, because the platforms are selling data across, right? And they're trading, I mean, the brokers, it's not contained to one platform or one financial services system.
So we had a question here in the back. White shirt? Yeah, you were
All right. Sorry.
still have your question.
Yeah, no, it's a very quick one. To what extent do you think that people in Silicon Valley are, top executives and so on, are oblivious to this rather than like they don't even see what where the problem might lie, and so the algorithm works really well, but the premises are wrong, but not just because of upbringing and not seeing certain things. So just people that by being uneducated or and of course by 2018 they should know better for the money. So not trying to justify that, just
Sure. I mean, I think they're largely underprepared, and I often will say that, if you're designing technology for society and you don't know anything about society, you're just unqualified. So you really can't. I don't think it's legitimate. Certainly, you wouldn't want me to perform, brain research, like brain surgery on you. Just because I've watched a lot of YouTube videos about, I have proximity to the knowledge, but it's not my lived experience of doing the surgery. I mean, this idea that these technologies get deployed on us, and of course they're fully loaded and baked, all the biases that people have get baked into them. But I can tell you, for example, having been a student and a faculty member at the University of Illinois, we've got 5 top computer science programs in the U.S. Illinois is one of them. Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, CMU, and MIT, and those are the 5 pipeline schools to Silicon Valley. I can tell you that the majority of students who come through there have AP, advanced placement tested, out of their humanities and social science requirements. So the last humanities class I might have been a high school English class, which is can you imagine? I mean, that makes my stomach hurt. And now you're rolling in, and it's not just undereducated. I mean, it's profoundly indoctrinated to believe that those courses do not matter, and that's also part of your lived experience. And you will have people who will declare themselves, a more real scientist, for example, than the rest of us who understand the complexities and nuances of these things. So I think it's partly that. I think it's also a whole pipeline. It's a structural issue that underprepares people. But I even think that even if they had a dual degree in ethnic studies, which I would love, or women's studies, that doesn't mean that at the individual site of intervention on your job, because many of us know who've worked in any kind of tech company, you have your discrete piece. If that doesn't mean that your pieces are going to link together powerfully and make the intervention that you want. So I think there is something about a failure of leadership, for sure, a defensiveness to these conversations, maybe even a hostility in some quarters with some companies, to even imagining that any of these ideas can be legitimate.
You think there's a level of unconscious bias in that? We all bring our own unconscious biases, and that's where diversity help to counteract them.
I mean, here's my problem with unconscious bias. This is just me going off on a thing now. If we argue and put a lot of stock in this notions of unconscious bias, it really lets everybody off the hook. Because how could I have known it was unconscious? So I think, again, that gets us back into these intent places. I don't think intent is the place where we should have to prove discrimination or wrongdoing. I think output and impact is the place where we measure. And then we look to see where is the intervention. It might be in policy, it might be in hiring, it might be in training and development, right? It might be in civil and human rights around our data profiles, transparency, privacy, the things that we care about. But I don't think that I'm willing to give anybody a pass on unconscious bias. And I'm also not going to say, it's like everybody has unconscious bias or everybody is biased, then bias doesn't have any meaning. If we talk about diversity and we're talking, instead of talking about diversity, when we used to talk about diversity in the 90s, that was a good decade, we were talking about racism and discrimination and people who have been historically oppressed. And we were saying, we need more people who have been historically excluded and discriminated against in the university, in the workplace, etc. Now we call it diversity, and we've gone so far to the absurdity of cognitive diversity, which is that's laughable. Everybody thinks differently. Are there two people on the planet who think alike ever? No. So then cognitive diversity, again, is like another unconscious bias. It actually doesn't help us intervene on remedying discrimination and oppression, and it certainly will never alleviate the conditions of oppression, talking about unconscious bias or talking about cognitive diversity or even just diversity. I think we have to talk about what's the kind of world we want to live in. Is it full of people who can't eat? Is it full of people who have to pay more because of the history of oppression? Is that okay? If it's not, what do we want different? And how are we going to do it differently? That seems like a more powerful jumping off place to me than thinking about the individual heart purely, although the heart's not right.
So just a final question before we wrap it up. And I know that there will be many more people who have more questions on the back of the questions.
And we're going to be around for a while.
But we're going to be around for a while.
Yes.
But you definitely get the last question. You have your hand up for a while.
Thank you, that's so interesting. But specifically on the example of a search engine, I thought it was so interesting how search engine could perpetuate a negative stereotype, especially considering how pervasive they are. Up until this event, I'd be my first go to ask a question, maybe a little less after this. But so beyond moderation of these things, what other way? What is the way to kind of address that? Is it through the fundamental construction of the technology, or is there?
I think it's that we need to separate advertising-driven content from real knowledge, and we need to be really clear about that line of demarcation. So in the book, I have a whole chapter, for example, about Dylan Roof and what happened when he went and did these queries, and then, of course, ultimately was radicalized and went and shot up a church of 9 African-American worshipers in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015. So he's looking for knowledge and trying to do sense-making work about the case of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, the trials going on George Zimmerman, and he's led to all these white supremacist sites. So, if we're looking for where's the closest coffee shop, probably pretty solid. If we're looking for help me make sense of George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, definitely not solid. So I think we have to, and one of the things that I often say to policy people is you cannot call for regulation of, say, disinformation in these spaces, like a search engine or in Facebook and social media, and then simultaneously defund every public information alternative, like schools, libraries, public media, right? Those are the resources that we have in the public that really bolster democracy and are more credible and more vetted, not perfect, but we can have some place to contest there, the forms of knowledge there. We don't have any space to contest in a privately held search engine, in a private search company, or in a social media platform. And I think making those demarcations really clear is important, because the public right now thinks that Google is a trusted public good. Yeah. And I think they use it like the library, because the library is also being shut down in the internet community. That's a good question. I feel like that's the universal honest.
I don't
know, is that just me? Do I read it that way? Okay, all right.
Okay, so
I have one thing. Yes.
Know,
okay.
I'm
okay. So I have the last one. All right.
I'll model it.
The last book I brought. I didn't know it was hard to get here, but apparently it's a little bit.
It's sold out. That's why
Oh,
it's hard to get.
Okay. So we're gonna just throw it up, and you guys can mob for it. No, I wanted to. just gonna throw it out. So I wanted to donate this to the Federation, and maybe you have a library, or maybe this could jumpstart a library, or we could kick off a library, or it could just be somewhere where it can be shared, and I don't know who should come and receive it on behalf of the Federation. Get out of here, guys. All right, so. Thank you so much. I know you have one. She had one that made me feel so good, I know. But anyway, thank you all so much. Please stay in touch with me.